Recording is in progress, and I will turn it over to Roger.
Thank you, Tim. Let me share my presentation. Okie dokie. Can you all see my slide, number one? Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. We're going to talk about how to avoid audit finding. Now, this is a really broad subject, as you all know. I wish I had a crystal ball where I could just tell you that if you do this for sure, you will never have a finding. But as you all know, different agencies, the way they do their audits, it also depends upon who the auditor is, or different types of audits, or the levels of audit. But most of the content that I have for this presentation is based on my, couple of years of monitoring projects here at TASA. So before I dive into that, let me just give you a little bit history about myself. My name is Roger Hingorani. I am a nonprofit compliance auditor. I retired from the Texas Education Agency about 3 years ago. I was their director of the Federal Fiscal Monitoring, basically in charge of about 25 to 30 auditors, monitoring of all the money, about 6,000 federal grants that came from the USD to the Texas Education Agency. So we basically conducted all sorts of monitoring activities, starting from regular desk monitoring, on-site monitoring, investigations, and single audit reviews, and all that. So I do have extensive experience working with the federal funds. So hopefully I will try to give you as many answers as I can. Like I said, I've always worked with the federal funds pretty much throughout my adult life. So let's dive into it. Um, Basically, why TASA monitors our grantees. So one of the main reason, or one of the main factor behind that, is we have a contract for service agreement with grantees that basically requires grantees to comply with state, federal rules and regulation, and we are required to monitor that. We are also required to make sure that the grantees are complying with CFR 200, which is also embedded or incorporated in each contract, that they will comply with these federal regulations. And there are sometimes monitoring protocols that each funding agency also requires us to, like certain number of audits or monitoring visits. So that also depends upon the each funders that gives us this money. So before I dive into the monitoring part, I just want to explain a little bit about how are these grants funded and what is TASA's role into it. So most of the grants that TASA has right now, the federal grants are called pass-through grants. And these are the grants that are type of federal funding that are awarded to one organization, which then distributes the funds or passes them to another organization or an individual for the purpose of carrying out a specific project or program. So we receive the grant, we distribute the grant to other grantees, but at the end of the day, everybody has to follow the same rules and regulations pertaining to the grant. So we are a subrecipient of a state agency, and you are a subrecipient of TASA. We all have to make sure that we follow the rules and regulation to carry out the specific projects so we can meet the intent and purpose of those projects. Here's an actual requirement, basically from the 2 CFR 200. As you all know, we always are trying to be in compliance with 2 CFR 200. So everything what we do, the audits or monitoring reviews, these are all based on the 2 CFR 200. So as a pass-through entity, TASA is responsible for ensuring Grant funds are spent according to applicable laws, rules, and regulation, and overall performance of a subrecipient to ensure that goals and objectives of sub-awards are achieved. So that is our main purpose of conducting these reviews. In monitoring a subrecipient, a pass-through entity, which is TASA, must review its financial and performance report. That's why we always have you send us the performance report. Sometimes it's quarterly, sometimes is annually, but this is a part of our job to make sure we collect that data so that federal government can use this data in future to award these grants. We also are required to provide trainings and technical assistance on fiscal and program related matter. Peggy is here. She provides a lot of program support. And me as a finance person, whenever there's a question about technical or finance fiscal question, we are always ready to answer those questions. Before we go into monitoring, I want to talk a little bit about the risk assessment. Since there are so many grantees but there are only limited resources to monitor the grantees, all the basically the subrecipient, like for us, the TASA, we are required to conduct a risk assessment. So basically, all the pass-through entities must evaluate each subrecipient's risk of non-compliance with federal statutes, regulations, and terms of conditions of the subaward for the purpose of determining the appropriate subrecipient monitoring. So because we have so many grantees, I'm just the only one auditor, and I want to make sure that I focus on the areas where we can actually achieve the best results for our grantees. So we have to do a risk assessment basically. So there are certain factors we consider when we are doing our risk assessment, and here are the key factors that almost all of the subrecipients or the funders use to come up with the risk assessment. Number one is the financial stability of the entity or a grantee. How are they doing? Are they paying their bills on time? Are they submitting their expenses on time? Are their records in order? We want to make sure that they are able to manage their grants. So we look at the history, how they have done with the other grants, or have we had any issues them managing the grants? If it's a new entity or basically we have a huge turnover of the fiscal staff, then that also becomes a risk factor because now we are dealing with the folks who may not have the relevant experience to administer the grant. We also want to look at their historical performance of their grant objective. Did they achieve their grant objectives with the same grant or the other grants? We will also look at the previous audit reports and if there's any findings. Whenever you have a single audit report, you are required to submit those to us. We will make sure that there are no findings related to the federal funds in that single audit. Or if we've done any previous audits or monitoring visits of you, we will take a look at those to make sure that those findings or those issues are not repeated. And the last thing we look at is what's the level of funding from TASA? If you're receiving 50 to 60% of the funding from TASA, then we definitely have a higher burden of making sure that you are monitoring. Versus if we just had 5 to 10%, we know you have a lot of other funding coming from different state or federal agencies, and they are also looking at your books and making sure that those funds are being spent correctly. So now we've done the risk assessment. We've determined, who are we going to, but basically that's when we need to determine which grantee to monitor. We normally have the scoring system, and we go from, whoever receives the highest score based on our risk assessment, then that's the grantee that we basically select for monitoring. Then we also have to decide what type of monitoring do we want to do. Do we want to do just a desk review? Do we want to do on-site reviews? Can we do just a technical assistant? So depending upon the risk level, we also basically decide the type of monitoring that we want to do. And once again, further diving into it, the details of the monitoring at different levels of detail. Do I select 50 transactions to monitor, or can I just have 10 transactions and they'll give me enough detail or enough information so that way I can reasonably provide an assurance that this grantee is making it's using the funds as appropriated by the grant fund. Basically, sometimes we will go, if there is some emphasis on specific programs, like, for instance, if a grantee has certain different type of expenses that are not very common. So we will kind of target those kind of things, to make sure that some of the expenses that are more vulnerable, you could say, that we want to make sure that those expenses are reviewed. So basically, once we have the risk assessment, we then come up with the type of monitoring we want to conduct for the each grantee. Any questions so far? If not, I will move on. So here's a sample desk review of our TASA. This is our process. Now, again, majority of the entities would have similar processes, but this is the way we conduct our reviews. And this is the way I used to conduct reviews in my previous jobs as an auditor. So these are not very uncommon. Most of the agencies or will probably use some of the out that are outlined here. So the number one we look at is policies and procedures if during the grant period. When in 2014, the 2 CFR 200, all the other circulars were rolled into that 2 CFR 200, there was a big emphasis on the internal controls. Internal controls became the biggest thing of the compliance. Basically, it required grantees to list the policies and procedures. It required grantees to basically do their own internal control audits and list as many as things that they can do to prevent um, misuse or misappropriation of the funds. So that's the very first thing we look at is your policies and procedures to make sure that you have all the required policies and procedures as required by the 2 CFR 200. We will look at your financial records. We want to make sure that you have a chart of accounts, your general ledgers, your payroll journals. We want to make sure that you are appropriating or you're budgeting and your grants separately from the other grants. We want to make sure we want to see your revenues and expenditures separately on the general ledger for each grant. We will look at your accounting software. Now, we understand the softwares are sometimes have limited capabilities, but at least we want to understand what your software is capable of doing it. And so that way we can ask you to provide us certain reports that you are able to get it from your software so we can proceed with our audit work. We will look at your budgets and expenditure of grant funds. We want to make sure that you have all these identified correctly in your financial records, in your general ledger. Ideally, we would like to see budgets, opening budgets and expenditures and the outstanding balances. But definitely, those are the things that we are looking at it. And finally, when we select our transactions, both payroll and non-payroll transactions, we ask you to provide us the supporting documentation, which can include job descriptions, time and effort records, contracts, agreements, receipts and billings, and allocation of costs, etc. So these are basically, this is our main main review process that we try to kind of follow to conduct our audits. So moving on, once we have looked at your initial documentation, your internal controls, your policies and procedures, your financial records, then basically, we come up with the preliminary report, which is when we issue the preliminary report, there are basically two types of issues reported in the preliminary report. The first one is audit observation. These are like minor issues or deviations noted during the audit that does not necessarily indicate a non-compliance, but it may require some attention. Usually, recommendations are made rather than mandatory corrective actions that are required for the resolution. So this is something we know it's not going to cause you to be in out of compliance. You may have a policy, but it may not be very explicit, or it may not make much, doesn't give us all the information that we are looking for. So that's where we call it an observation. And usually we will ask you not, we don't even expect the response from you. We will give you a recommendation to correct it. The second thing is more important. This is the audit finding. This is where a significant issue that indicates a non-compliance, inefficiency, or weakness, control weaknesses that may or may not include question cause. Some findings may have a question cause because it's just totally out of compliance. And those must be formally addressed, often requiring a corrective action plan. In this case, we'll issue a finding. We'll ask you to give us a corrective action to resolve the finding. As I mentioned to you earlier, some of these audit findings may have question cause, and these questions cause can generally be resolved through corrective actions. So what are question costs? These are the expenses charged to the federal award that an auditor deems potentially non-compliant or lack of sufficient documentation. Remember, the word here is potentially non-compliant, which means that if you provide adequate documentation or supporting documentation, they could be reversed. So there are pretty much three categories. One are just unallowable. The expenditure or cost does not align with the terms and condition of the federal grant regulations or applicable statutes. You may have a perfectly good expense, you may have a supporting documentation, but it just doesn't align with what you were supposed to be doing with that program. So in that case, we could say that this is an unallowable cost. The second one is very easy, the unsupported cost. You just have enough, I'm sorry about that. You just don't have the supporting documentation. You paid something with the grant fund, and basically you don't now have a supporting documentation to show us either a billing receipt or the statement or something. When that certainly becomes a unallowable cost or unsupported cost, and that's basically now you're telling us that this expense was necessary, reasonable, or properly allocated for the grant. Without the supporting documentation, everything is missing on that. And finally, not allocable. The cost could be excessive, not clearly related to the purpose of the grant. This is what this is where sometimes the reasonable comes in. Did you pay too much for the job that you could have easily done through different, like being, instead of traveling to further away than having attending a conference, same conference in the same city? So sometimes those cannot be allowed because they are just not necessary, reasonable, or may not be able to allocate. Any questions so far? Should I move on, Tim? Okay.
There's nothing in the chat.
Sounds good.
Folks,
Okay.
if you have questions at any point, or there's even language that's unfamiliar, please don't hesitate to use the chat to let us know.
Sounds okay. I'll proceed. Corrective actions, we just talked about it. So what are corrective actions? You will see this after every finding. We will ask you to provide a corrective action. Sometimes we will tell you what the corrective action should be, like we want to have the supporting documentation, we want to have additional documentation. So these are basically series of measures taken by a grantee to address issues identified in the monitoring report or other official notice regarding the non-compliance. Even in your single audit, once who goes, the grantees who have a fortune of getting the single audit done, they are familiar with these corrective actions that they have to provide to their independent auditor. The grantee is basically required to address the particular issue within the defined time frame. We will give you, like in our case, we will give you about 2 weeks to or 10 business days to provide us that corrective action. Sometime it's just we will just tell you that you need to implement or strengthen your policies and procedures to avoid the findings in the future. If the expenses are found to be unallowable or unsupported, a recipient may be required to repay the fund. This happens in the rare case where you are actually are asked to give us the money back, you know. Um, but a lot of times, since we are doing a current year monitoring reviews, we are able to tell the folks to basically reallocate that cost to some other funding sources, preferably to a local funding sources, to avoid repaying the funds. And then in that case, you can basically use that money to pay for additional expenses. So we try to work with the grantees to make sure that we are not asking them to pay money back, you know. Sometimes the audit grantees are required to do additional reporting, like, hey, you need to send us on a monthly basis your journal ledger. So you need to send us a little bit more information or supporting documentation when you are submitting your reimbursement. And also, we ask the grantees to provide additional training so that the staff doesn't make those same mistakes. So those are basically about the corrective actions that are required after the audit report is issued. And generally, in the final report, most of these are resolved so that way the grantee is on a right track to take care of the grant. So these results are based on my monitoring reviews of ARP, SAM, SASP grants during the 23-24 year. And here are the main areas where I found these deficiencies. Um, and those include internal controls, financial management system, the payroll costs, mostly time and effort, documentation, and job descriptions, and then finally the non-payroll costs, just a lack of supporting documentation. So these are the key areas where we found the findings, and I'll be going through each area where what we found, and I'll also be giving you solutions on how to avoid these findings. I have some findings here. That is an exact language that was used to document regarding the policies and procedures. This is where the manuals basically lack the following policies and procedures. So, number one was time and effort. Sometimes you actually had time and effort, but you were missing the policies and procedures to comply with the time and effort, which is basically required according to 2 CFR 200-430. You're required to have a policies and procedures in your finance manual. I would also add that you should definitely have all the procedures, not just the policies, but procedures the staff has to take to report the time and effort. Once again, I want to emphasize that basically the 2 CFR 200 is big on internal controls. They want to make sure in the old circulars there was never a language where you're required to document your policies and procedures. And so, we really couldn't tell folks, hey, you didn't have a policy, so you didn't implement the requirements. But now with the new CFR 200, they have basically made mandatory that the folks have to have these policies and procedures in their manual and they have to comply with it. The next one is the procurement related to the procurement methods and thresholds. As you all know, federal procurement standards are a little bit different than many other standards, and they want you to have those different types of standard, whether it's micro purchase, small purchase, all those purchase requirements should be in your policies and procedures. They basically want the criteria for all the purchasing in the, and those are basically outlined in 2 CFR 200.320. I would just urge you to basically look at that 2 CFR 200.320 and then copy those, or at least incorporate those procedures or the thresholds in your policies and procedures because it's required. Inventory control. I know we all don't, our grantees don't buy a lot of goods or services with the grant funds. Most of it goes towards the payroll costs, but still, you are required to have those policies and procedures, and specifically the frequency of inventory that's taken by your organization in your financial policies and procedures manual. Travel is another one. You should have good travel authorization and reimbursement process in your policies and procedures. And finally, the conflict of interest. You should have written standards of conduct addressing the conflict of interest and governing the actions of employees engaged in the selection, award, and administration of contracts. So this is a pretty common finding I find, because a lot of the folks are missing this particular policy in their finance manual. So how do we avoid the audit findings on these policies and procedures? Well, number one, you have to review and update policies and procedures at least annually or even biannually to keep them up to date. You can prioritize procedures that have the most impact on the organization or are tied to the early stage award activities like time and effort. Those policies and procedures will be implemented within the first month of your grant. So you want to make sure that those are in your manual, and those are have all the requirements that you're going to have for employees to document their time and effort. You want to engage all the key stakeholders of your organization. Policies and procedures, fiscal policies and procedures is just not a finance thing. It requires you to have an input from your program people, your procurement people, and sometimes even legal guidance if it's necessary. Because time and effort has two components. You have folks working on the program, but they are reporting time, and then that goes to the payroll or the finance people so they can pay according to what they have reported. So it's a combination of both the program and finance. So I was always taught that if the activity is not allowed or didn't happen, it doesn't matter. You can have a finance documentation to support what you paid for, but if the activity was not allowed or it was not approved by the program, then you can't pay for that. So it's a combination of program and finance is extremely important when writing these policies and procedures. Always stay informed on the federal requirements to make sure that you are in compliance. Last October 2024, 2 CFR 200 was updated. Your capitalization threshold went from $5,000 to $10,000. Many of you, if you have capitalization threshold in your policies and procedures, you want to make sure that you want to update those based on the updates provided by 2 CFR 200. Another big change came when in during that update was that now you need a expenses of more than $1 million or more for a single audit. It used to be $750,000 in expenses. Now they have raised the threshold to $1 million. So those are some of the things. They also made some procurement changes in micro purchase. So you definitely want to make sure that you are informed on these federal requirements so that you can change the policies and procedures according to the updates. I've seen some policies and procedures that were created 5, 6 years ago. Nothing has changed, and I'm reviewing some of them that have not been changed in the past 4 or 5 years. And circulars have changed, rules have changed. So definitely, if you have policies and procedures and it's just outdated, it really doesn't do any good for the grant, because you are required to follow those policies and procedures to administer the grant. And if you are not complying, or if you're not implying those policies and procedures, or if you're using the old policies and procedures, then your whole administration of grant can really have a lot of issues. So definitely pay attention to those requirements. Um, Make sure that you incorporate all your required policies and procedures in the manual. Align your financial system with the approved policies and procedures. Remember, we talked about the capitalization threshold going up from $5,000 to $10,000. You want to make sure that your financial management system, if you're documenting that has been updated. And the last thing, or most important thing, I would say, is train your staff on the updated policies and procedures. If there's just one person who's basically keeping updating and keeping these policies and procedures, then the staff doesn't know about it or how to implement them. So you definitely want to train staff to make sure that they are all are implementing the new or updated policies and procedures. And also, you want to make sure that these are approved officially by some officials, and they should be dated by authorized staff, or sometimes even the board members. So it really depends. If they are broad policies, then you may want the board approval. But if they are just basically procedures, then a CFO or even a finance person can document those procedures. But we definitely like to see a policies and procedures manual that is officially approved and dated, so we can see when it was implemented. And every time you update that, you need to do that. So here are basically the policies and procedures that are required by 2 CFR 200. Time and effort, conflict of interest, contracts and procurement, travel policy, inventory control, allowable items of cost, and cash management. So you should look into your policies and procedures manual and see if you have these policies or not. The next thing we look at it after we've reviewed your financial policies and procedures is your financial management system. We want to make sure that your financial management system is has budgets in it. And sometimes, like in this finding, we did not see any budgets or any appropriations in your financial management system. I understand some of you use reimbursement methods, so you have Salesforce, it has all the budgets in there, but it's a good idea to have a financial management system that when you start your grant with, you know how much money you're allocating for each category, to have that in your financial management system, so then you can see that balance on an ongoing basis. It'll give you an idea where you stand for each. And if you use the encumbrances, it's even better, because that'll tell you exactly how much money you have left over. Another finding we had, that the general ledgers did not have all the information that we are looking for. And that's something, sometimes the software is just it is not capable of doing that. So definitely you want to make sure that the financial records or your general ledger has all the details that we are looking for. And normally when we ask you to provide a general ledger, we will tell you these are some of the things that we want to see in your general ledger. So how do we avoid these findings with the financial management system? Very easy. Simply set up the initial budget for the comparison of expenditures with the budget amount for each federal award. Maintain records that sufficiently identify the amount, source, and expenses of federal funds for each federal award, so we can clearly see where the money came in, where the money went. And so these records must contain the necessary information such as authorization, fiscal obligation, unobligated balances, as well as assets, expenditure, and income. If you have some of these things in your financial records, then you're doing a very good job. And of course, at the end of the day, all records must be supported by the source documentation. So this is a really easy fix. You just have to make sure that your whatever the accounting software you're using, that you are using the appropriate things to make sure that you are getting us the information that we are looking for. Are job descriptions required by law? How many of you think that they are required by law? If you just put it in the chat box. I'll wait 2 minutes. You're muted, Tim. I'm sorry.
We have lots of yeses.
Lots of yeses. Well, I'm glad we are on the right track. Our grantees are on the right track, which is always comforting to know. Okay. All right. So while the 2 CFR 200 does not explicitly say that job description must be maintained, maintaining them is the best practice to ensure compliance with the federal cost principles, specifically time and effort. But there's another way it kind of makes it required, and that is that 2 CFR 200-430 requires that the records must be maintained to justify salary costs charged to the federal award. What better way to do that is to show on your job descriptions. And finally, job descriptions are part of the documentation supporting payroll expenses and must align with individuals' actual work performed. When we are looking at the job description or when we are looking at the time and effort, and we will go more in detail when we talk about the time and effort, but job description, time and effort go hand in hand because that's where you are approved. Here's this position. This is what this position is going to do for our grant or whatever the grant is funded from. These are the activities listed in the job description. So it really becomes a part of the payroll supporting documentation for the time and effort. So thank you so much for your answers. That was a yes, good answer. Some of the issues that we noted when we reviewed job descriptions, that the job duties noted on the job description did not align with the activities required by the program guidelines. I always bug Peggy. Peggy, can you look at this job description? And she will tell me, no, this has something that doesn't align with our program. So we always discuss, like I said, program and finance has to work together. To make sure that the project is conducted according to the rules, regulations. So yeah, definitely, we have seen in bunch of cases where the job description did not align with the activities. Sometimes they are missing specific activities, to fulfill the program. There are certain programs that require you to list these activities to make sure that you are actually, meeting the intent and purpose of the programs. Sometimes there are folks, in our grantees, many folks change their positions, during the fiscal year. And in that case, sometimes we saw that they lack the specific job functions in their job description for each program that they had. All of a sudden, somebody after 6 months changes the job. Now their job description has not been updated, so they are working on a completely different set of activities. How do we avoid the audit finding? Very simple. Update job description of employees annually or whenever the job duties are changed or updated. As soon as somebody's job duties are changed, please go back and look at their job description. Specify the percentage of funding sources contributing to the position and identify the job duties performed for each funding sources. If you're split funding this employees and paying them from different funding sources, different federal or state funding sources, I would like to see, or we would like to see, for each funding sources, what activities are you going to perform? And if you can identify those in the job description, it becomes a good, it kind of creates a good audit trail. So definitely recommend that you have a percentage of the funding that the person is being paid, and then outline the job duties that goes with that funding source. Clearly outline the tasks directly related to the grant objectives. The duties must be aligned with the allowable cost under the program guideline. Ensure that the job descriptions are signed and dated by the employee. Why do we want them signed and dated? Because the signed and dated description kind of provides you an assurance that the employee acknowledged that they have read and understood, which with the clear set of expectations. They know what they are supposed to be doing. They have signed for it. So they can come back and say, well, I didn't know if I was supposed to do this. I did that, that kind of, so that's why it's really important that they are signed and dated by an employee. I've seen job descriptions created 5, 6 years ago, never updated, never changed, and the employee is working on a totally different, set of activities. For grants funded positions, signed job description may be required to demonstrate compliance with program requirements or organization policies. Any questions so far? Okay, I'll move on. So time and effort, I did the session yesterday on time and effort. So hopefully I've covered a lot of that issues yesterday, but I'll go over again some of the findings that we encounter in reviewing time and effort. And sometimes this happens very rarely, but we just did not receive any time and effort for the payroll cost charged to the grant. We received timesheets, but not the time and effort. So that is a big issue. You definitely, and I showed the difference between what is a timesheet and a time and effort report. So definitely, we want to make sure that if you are paying any employee any part of the funds from the federal funds, then they should be reporting time and effort. The grant funded activities reported on the time and effort documentation did not align with the program objectives. Sometimes there is time and effort, everything is fine, but the activities are just not approved for the grant. Time and effort documentation for the employee partially paid with the grant fund did not account for the total activity of which the employee was compensated from all funding sources. Remember, time and effort is based on your total activities, just not a 40-hour work week. It's whatever per week you have and how much the percentage of that time you spent on the federal grant, you're supposed to document that. And some of the time and effort reporting document we received missed that. How to avoid the finding? Well, number one, if you're paying any employee fully or partially for federal funds, then they should have a time and effort documentation. Make sure that your time and effort documentation is aligned with the job duties approved for the grant. We also want to make sure that you have really good policies and procedures in your policy manual to make sure that employees knows about what the rules are. If there are detailed procedures of maintaining time and effort, that makes their job easier also. They can just follow those procedures and they can report their time and effort. You want to make sure that you are consistently reviewing their time and effort records, to make sure that the costs are allocated are appropriately and activities are reported for each funding source. So either a program director or whoever is in charge of making sure that these reports are done correctly. I know my time and reports are reviewed by Tim almost every week. Making sure that we are doing everything right. And so definitely we need an oversight to make sure that time and effort reports are reported correctly. And finally, reconcile your time and effort with the payroll changes at least quarterly. You're going to start your time and effort on based on the budgeted estimate for an employee, whatever the percentage you feel that is required to conduct the activities of the program, but that may change. The employee may be spending more time or less time. So you want to make sure that payroll matches with that time and effort that is reported. So you definitely want to make sure that you're reconciling, because at the end of the year, what they have reported on the time and effort is what they should be paid, if they are reporting their time and effort actually and not just the budgeted percentages. Supporting documentation. This is very easy, and we didn't encounter a lot, but some grantees fail to provide us a third-party documentation such as billing statement, itemized receipt, or invoices. So we want to make sure that anything you have purchased, you want to keep a receipt. You don't have a receipt, that is definitely an unallowable cost and a question cost. So please make sure that you have all the supporting documentation. I have created a document checklist for both the payroll and non-payroll costs, at least for what we are looking for it when we are monitoring. You may have a lot more or some less from the other monitoring entities, but this is what we are looking for. Number one is signed and dated job description that includes the employee's official job title. We want to make sure that you have complete time and effort records. We would also like to see employment contract or salary authorizations to make sure that you're paying the employee what was promised or what was agreed upon between the employee and the employer. We like to see your policies and procedures on payroll, and definitely payroll journals and all the payroll records documenting, because we want to make sure that when you're claiming those expenses that you have payroll journals, that transaction is reflected in your journal ledgers and all that. So definitely we want to see all of those documentation. And finally, maintain your personnel records. When we are on site, we will be looking at the personnel records with all the personnel files. So definitely you want to make sure that you have these documents ready if you are being monitored. And here's a list of non-payroll costs. This is once again, basic information that we are looking for. We're looking for chart of accounts, general ledgers to see how you have how you're documenting the grants and the revenues and expenditures of each grant. Once again, policies and procedures. If you if you have purchase order system, we would like to see the purchase orders, requisition forms, which I highly encourage the use of purchase orders, because that will, basically you can then encumber some of these amounts, or, it's a good idea to have a purchase order system, which is, again, you can have a checks and control, like who signs the purchase orders, who approves the purchase order, etc. We definitely want to see third-party documentation, invoice, receipts, billing statements. If they are professional and contracted service, we want to make sure you have an executed agreement or a contract, including any exhibits, amendments, and other supporting documentation. For travel authorization and reimbursement vouchers, including the supporting documentation for the trip, the total cost charged to the grant, which includes hotel billing statement, meal receipts, travel itinerary, mileage logs, etc. And finally, your procurement records, showing which procurement method you use to procure the goods and services with the grant fund. This is just my basic slide. I shared this with you yesterday. In order for um, expenses of the federal grant to be allowable, it must be necessary, reasonable, and allocable, comply with the cost principle and federal award, be consistent with the policies and procedures applying uniformly to federal and non-federal activities and costs, be adequately documented, and be incurred during the approved grant period. This is for each and every grant expense. So I guess we have some time for the discussion question, right, Tim? Okay. Can employee record their time and effort in advance based on the percentage of their salaries allocated to each funding source? If you can put your answer in the chat, we would appreciate that.
Immediate no's across the board.
Awesome, awesome. No, time and effort must be reported after the actual work is performed for each funding source, whether it's periodic certification or activity report or whatever the name you want to use it, personnel activity report, they should all be must be signed and dated after the work is performed. Are job descriptions required to list the funding sources and activities associated with each funding sources?
I have 3 yeses,
Okay.
4, 5, 6, 7. And
Okay.
then we have a no and
So,
a yes.
okay. So it is recommended because the job description specify a role is funded by a particular grant and outline the associated responsibility tied to that funding. If you don't put that, then it becomes we have to kind of figure it out what's in this job description that applies to that particular grant, specifically if the employee is split funded. So it's always a best practice to have a job description, specify the role with that as funded by a particular grant and outline the associated responsibilities. So thank you again. Good answers. Is it necessary to include federal procurement standards, including thresholds for various types of purchases made with federal funds, in the policies and procedures manual if less than 10% of the grant expenditures are budgeted for non-payroll expenses? So you only have, say, 5% of the payroll expenses. Why bother putting these policies and procedures in the manual?
Several yeses. More yeses.
Very good. Man, we have a really strong audience here, a very knowledgeable audience. I'm glad. Yes, because remember, it is a requirement, it is necessary to include federal procurement standards and thresholds in the policies and procedures, regardless of whether it's less than 10% of the grant expenditures, because the 2 CFR 200 applies to all purchases made with federal funds, not just anything less than 5% or 10%. And once again, it is a requirement by the 2 CFR 200 to make sure that you have these policies and procedures. And I think this is the last one. Are federal procurement standards applicable to professional and contracted services paid with federal grant funds?
Yes, yes, yes. Bunch of yeses.
So, yes, the federal procurement standards are applicable to professional and contracted services paid with grant fund. Basically, 2 CFR 200 requires that all purchases made are made fairly and competitively, even acquiring professional or contracted services. So, yeah, the answer is definitely yes. All right, I think that brings us to our technical assistance slide here. And I just wanted to remind everyone that we have a really good support from Mark Hernandez. You can reach out to either me or him for an ongoing support and technical assistance with any type of fiscal compliance. And we strongly encourage you to contact us. And we'll be available to you anytime you need any assistance. And I think Mark wanted to add a few things here, right, Mark? I'll go
Yes,
ahead and let you, yeah.
yes, I was going to have a little discussion question about if anybody's had any kind of unique type of audit findings that have not been on this part that Roger has done. And before we kind of answer those kind of questions and everything, I think we can end the recording at this point so we can just keep you know, any questions or saying, oh, I have this thing. And I would give kind of the first example.